Welcome to the Michelle Meow Show at the Commonwealth Club of California. I'm John Zipperer, the club's Vice President of Media and Editorial, and Michelle's co-host here at the club, or virtually here at the club. We hope you are staying safe and are well wherever you are, and we look forward to seeing you again in person someday in the future at the club's headquarters in San Francisco. Until that happens, we are doing all of our programming online. This, in fact, is the latest in more than 250 online programs the club has produced just in the past 6 months. You can find all of our upcoming programs, as well as audio and video from our past programs, as well as how you can support our program production at commonwealthclub.org. Now, if you are watching us live on YouTube or Facebook, you can use the chat function, post some questions. We can work them into our discussion today with our special guest. And we will get started in just a moment. But first, I have to introduce Michelle Meow. She's the member of the Commonwealth Club's Board of Governors and the host of The Michelle Meow Show. Good to see you again, Michelle.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you to all of you for joining us. And thank you to the Commonwealth Club for providing a platform for us to have these important conversations. A recent draft report by Michael E. Horowitz was discussed in an article by the New York Times in which it pointed to top DOJ officials such as then Attorney General Jeff Sessions and then Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein, who were the driving force behind President Trump's zero tolerance policy. And so if you'll remember, the zero tolerance policy resulted in thousands of migrant children being separated by their families. I was following, the news during that time, and I personally cannot get rid of the image of children crammed into detention centers and cages with sleeping on mats with nothing but a solar blanket covering them. And I could not even, in my mind, even understand, what kind of a public health concern or crisis that would be. Now imagine what the rest of our migrant communities might have been facing and how it may have impacted other vulnerable communities such as LGBTQI people seeking asylum. Our guest today volunteered in Tijuana, Mexico with two organizations, Transgender Law Center and El Otro Lado. He's a law student, an award-winning writer, and located in New Orleans. They have a bachelor degree focused on English literature and gender and women's studies from the University of California, Berkeley. Julie is an ambassador for the CDC program Let's Stop HIV Together and is student liaison for the American Bar Association's Health Law section and also a writer for thebody.com. So let's welcome Julie Alvarenga to the program. Julie, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you for having me.
It's timely that the article came out in that way. I think many of those who were doing the work probably knew, who was the driving force behind the zero tolerance policy. I think that it would be great for a lot of folks who are tuning in today to understand, even the context of migration from Central America. We'll start with your story and your own, family story of migrating to the United States.
Yes, definitely. Thank you. So yeah, my family is from El Salvador, and they migrated here in like the late 80s and 90s during the Civil War, which ended in 91. This definitely took a toll on families, and many people had to, force migration into the United States, among other countries like Canada and places like in Australia. And so you see the Salvadoran diaspora is pretty spread out, and a lot of that had to do with the difficulty of living in a country that was torn apart by war, and not just any war, but a civil war which divided the people. A civil war that was also, where the U.S. also played a role, with U.S. policies, which is nothing new. We see that right now currently with what's happening in Honduras. And that's exactly why there's been a huge wave of migration, specifically from places in Honduras, like these caravans that are making their way through. I also, so just to be on topic, our family migrated to Los Angeles, specifically Lincoln Heights area, Koreatown, which is where a lot of my family still stays. And that's been sort of like our lived experience, And so now that I'm doing this work as a law student, and having also organized in Los Angeles with the Central American Resource Center, and also collaborated with firms that do pro bono work like Munger, Tolson, Olson. I've seen this full circle, basically, in terms of how that was my, I'm a child of the diaspora. I'm here because of what happened in the 80s and 90s, and now as an adult, I'm witnessing this once again, and in a professional trajectory, but I can't help but also make it personal too, because this is very much embedded in my family's lived experience.
You've written that you learned a lot about your family's background in El Salvador, its history and its culture and all that from your family, of course, here and other migrants. Is the El Salvadoran community in the U.S. well connected and networking, or is it you mentioned it being spread out? So or is it maybe too far apart that across the country that you don't have those connections?
Before I answer that question, I just want to clarify that we identify as Salvadoran, so you don't have to add the El Salvadoran to that.
Okay.
That's just something that a lot of people get confused with, and so I'm just kind of like also just want to like check that. But yeah, the Salvadoran community, I would say, at least from like the perspective of my families, they were they were very strongly knit. Like my dad's side of the family is from a town called Ciudad Arce, which is like the name of the town, and it's really close proximity to the capital, San Salvador. And so a lot of family friends and cousins, because my dad's side, the Alvarenga family is a big family in El Salvador. They all had a plan. They really did have like a tight community, and they chose Los Angeles as a way of like making it their second home. And so with that came a lot of like networking within like the family and friends in the community, and really supporting one another, because I always tell people that my mom and my dad have two different lived experiences, even though they're from the same country. My mother, she grew up middle class. She went to private school her whole life, Catholic private school. Um, Her family hasn't, they're educated. Like my great uncle, he was a professor at the University of Central America, which is a Jesuit university. And so there's just, even in such a small country, you notice how different people's lives can be. And so, my mother, she came in a visa. She had the opportunity, she had the privilege to come in through with a visa, and later, filed for some form of status. However, my dad's family was definitely in poverty, and you can understand why family and community is so important, because you need to support one another to get through these ordeals. I remember stories from my aunt, mi tia Tita, telling me how they used to hide from. They didn't know who was there, who they were hiding from, whether it was the FMLN or the government, because they didn't have the luxury to choose a side. They just wanted to make sure that they were safe, and that they hid when their parents were out in the farms, working. And so my tia Tita, who was the oldest, one of the oldest, she's the second oldest, I should say, she took care of a lot of like the siblings. And my dad is one of the younger ones. He's like the second youngest one. And so he experienced that was his lived experience in his home country. And so networking and supporting one another was really huge, especially on his end, and the family and friends that they knew. So little by little, when they needed to migrate, they started to trickle over to Los Angeles, and it became a pipeline of support from one another. And this is not organizing, this is not a work, this is just them, trying to survive, and they did. And now the good thing is that over the years, like they built my grandparents a home, because my grandparents would eventually like travel to the US, and then with a visa, and then come back. And so little by little, you got to see how community and family played a role. Now they have like a beautiful house, and they're evangelical, and so they have a church there as well. My grandfather passed away a few years ago, but my grandmother is still alive, and she lives in that home. And it's all been because of like the family support. My father was very adamant about always sending money back to El Salvador to support his family.
Julie, thank you so much for sharing your personal family migration story, and it's one of many, thousands of stories in which I feel like this administration has stolen the narrative of the actual true migration, stories of countless families. And what I mean by that is this narrative that those who are seeking asylum or who are migrants coming from Central America are escaping, or not escaping, but they themselves are part of, criminal activity of some sort. So, whether that's just to come and break immigration laws of the United States, or that, the countries have their problems and the countries are not taking care of their problems. But what people don't understand is what you've just demonstrated here for us is that it's been decades of issues involving U.S. policies that have created, have contributed to the migration. And so I really wanted a moment for us to highlight that so people understand, and especially as we get near election and immigration is a hot topic. Any more you want to add to making sure people, understand the right narrative in terms of migration from Central America?
Yes, I really want to stress that both administrations, both parties have been very unkind to migrants. Like there's like this, I think the Statue of Liberty, right, says, "Bring me you're tired, you're old and everything," and that's not what the Obama administration did either. I really just want to clarify that the Obama administration also had children sleeping on the floor with those aluminum sheets, and I know this because I was working with the Central American Resource Center at that time. I'm in law school now, but I'm fairly seasoned, and I took like a few years to really decide what I wanted to do before I jumped into law school. And so after I had graduated from Berkeley, I moved back to Los Angeles, and I started to work with the Central American Resource Center there because the Office of Refugee and Resettlement had just opened their just started to get funding to work with unaccompanied minors. And so I will say, though, that the Obama administration is doing definitely a better job than what's happening right now. I just really want to clarify and debunk any myths, because we have such a terrible person in office right now, but people forget that people have done terrible things in the past. And so it's really just about critical analysis. And so I wanted to bring that up. But yeah, the Office of Refugee and Resettlement started to work with unaccompanied minors back in 2014, after a lot of these photos leaked that children were in cages. And we started to help, get them their special immigrant juvenile visas. Basically, what ended up happening there is that if they were unaccompanied and they presented themselves at the border and they were in one of those ORR camps where they have minors, then they get put in the system, they get an A number, and then they are sent out into the US with a family member or a friend. Now that's in theory, right? Sometimes I'm sure there's situations that were very sticky, and there were definitely cases on our end where we had to deal with things. But just to describe the pipeline of that, once they were with the family member and they were going to immigration court, specifically in Los Angeles, and we were filing for their juvenile visas, then they would be able to qualify for their LPR, which is legal permanent residency status. And kind of like from then on move forward into their naturalization. So that's kind of where I jumped into immigration, as a paralegal at that time. And so it's really interesting to compare both administrations and see the differences and what's happening, as we move forward with hopefully another president.
We've talked about, Michelle and I on the show in the past have talked about, of course, Obama's reputation as, the chief deporter or deporter in chief. Yeah. Michelle mentioned Jeff Sessions being quoted in that thing about how, we need to take the children away. There was an interview on the Bulwark podcast a couple weeks ago in which a former Trump administration official is relating how, when they were talking about building the wall and such, Donald Trump wanted there to be spikes on the top of the wall. He specifically apparently was talking about how great it would be if these spikes would be like going through the arms and the hands of the people who were trying to climb over. I mean, the pain was the point. This was, it kind of takes out any possible amelioration of their current policies, because you realize, no, this is not just them getting tough and trying to cut down numbers of immigrants. This was right from the top a genuine attempt to inflict pain on the most marginalized people.
This man is sick, and like honestly, sometimes when people are voting, they forget just how much power the executive branch has over agencies like DHS, ICE, the FBI, etc. These agencies. Obviously, like there's like checks and balance, and that really depends on statutes that are implemented by Congress and everything. But the president has a lot of power to hire and fire people, which is why. And these agencies are what makes the country move. We're seeing this right now, just within this immigration perspective, but even with the CDC, you can see how much the culture has changed, the language that gets changed in some of these platforms, depending on who is president. That is all really important to think about when we're voting someone in. And I was going somewhere with this. You had mentioned his rhetoric, how he wants to like put spikes up on this wall, and he doesn't care that he's plowing through the San Pedro River in Arizona. He doesn't care that he's violating a lot of like environmental protection laws. He doesn't care. He doesn't care that he's violating indigenous laws that have been passed. And there's just so much that's interconnected with immigration. It's not a one single issue. And it's really important that people do their research so that they understand. I remember I was in Tijuana in November of 2018. And you can probably remember these graphic images of US agents tear gassing into Tijuana. And there's like a photo that specifically shows a mother with 2 children as she's running away from the tear gas that they're doing. I was there that day. I was literally there at the office of El Otro Lado, less than a mile away on their 4th floor. And we were like right outside the roof witnessing this happen, and just swarms of people running back into Tijuana, because these helicopters were shooting into Mexico, into another country. So that speaks volumes of the violations that this administration has done. They don't care. They really are ruthless, and it's really important to not forget these things, because we tend to live in a state of historic amnesia, where we process so much every day on social media and the news, and everything is just so it's so dramatized that we forget the importance of what happened on these dates. And so I like to remind people that this happened in November of 2018, so it's about to be 2 years. And
Yeah, it's hard. Sorry, John, go ahead.
Well, no, this could have waited. I was just going to say, were you frustrated, annoyed at the fact that in last night's vice presidential debate, immigration really didn't come up? There was a bit of a kind of a drive-by mention of it, but it really was not a topic, even though it's such a hot button issue in this country.
It is a hot button issue, and I mean, and Kamala Harris is not someone that's has her hands clean on this either. Like she supports ICE very much, and she's taken photos with Border Patrol agents and everything, and she's had a notoriously ruthless track record as a prosecutor. And so I just want to say that just to hold a critical analysis of both ends, because I am frustrated at the fact that this is what I have to work with. I'm frustrated at the fact that this is like you even said, there was no conversation even around immigration, but we have thousands of people currently locked up, and they're migrants, they're refugees, then they're currently locked up during a pandemic. And I recently came out with a piece with thebody.com, which is a platform that I write for that does a lot of HIV work. And we brought in an attorney who was once affiliated with the Southern Poverty Law Center, Jeremy Jong, who I actually met while I was volunteering in Tijuana. And he can also share just the experiences, the trauma, the violations, that the health hazards that occur in these facilities. And I'm thinking about this, and I'm watching this debate last night, and I'm just thinking, are y'all not going to talk about the children and the families and the people with the pre-existing health conditions that are locked up in these places during a pandemic? I mean, y'all just are just here for your sound bites and for your witty clapbacks at each other, but people are literally dying as you have this debate. And it just makes me think you need to try a little harder. And I'm voting for Biden, don't get me wrong, but I really want to hold them accountable to this because they probably think that because Trump is this, just I don't even have the words to describe just the trash that this man is. They probably think that they have it in the bag, but no, hold yourselves accountable to your work, like, and do not compare yourself to this administration because the bar is so low. There's no need. Really
Mhm.
hold yourself to what you want to do around foreign policies, this pandemic, immigration. Um,
Yeah,
like we
yeah,
we and just to kind of like explain a little bit more, like immigration, like right now 44% of detained people in these facilities are Haitians. They're Black migrants. So we see how these Black communities are suffering both within the US and like, hovering over the border. And so it goes back to the fact that these issues are not one single issue. They're all correlated. They all have an intersection.
absolutely. And we'll talk a little later about, your thoughts as a law student and very soon here in the near future will be an attorney and kind of your views on the laws and immigration laws and what we mean when we're upholding laws, but what if the laws are violations of human rights? So we'll get to that. But I want to go back to your time when you spent the time spent with El Otro Lado, and I'm not sure if that was after the president had seized his zero tolerance policy or before, but wanted to get an idea of some of the experiences of what you witnessed. I think you had mentioned one example, the horrific tear gassing, being shot, through Mexico. But yeah, would love to hear more of kind of what you had witnessed and what the public health crisis might have looked like then.
Yeah, definitely. So I've continuously volunteered in Tijuana and like Mexicali since like 2018, and one of the organizations apart from Al Otro Lado that I've worked with is Border Kindness, but I can't say that I've worked with them long enough to really say um, like what they're doing right now. I will emphasize though that people need to support this organization, Border Kindness, because they are doing the same work that Al Otro Lado is doing, but on the other side, east of Baja California, like heading east, like towards that border of that state. And there's less resources there because Tijuana is a bigger city. And so there's more people, there's more, resources and everything. And so I kind of wanted to also just throw that out there so that people who are watching this, if you would like to make a donation to Border Kindness, you can Google them and you'll see the work that they're doing on that side of the border because every border is different, right? We can talk about Juarez, El Paso border, we can talk about Tijuana, San Diego borders, and et cetera. And it all varies. Every border is different. And so that's just kind of like some perspective that I've had. But most of my work over these last years has been in Tijuana. And you see how Tijuana is a city of migrants, and it's a beautiful city, and it's a city that welcomes people for the most part. There was definitely some tension when Central Americans were coming through, but people right now are supporting each other, and it's beautiful to witness that. There's a huge Haitian community there as well, and you see the Haitian community also working in tandem with folks from Tijuana, and how there is that support, and that's something that I really admire about Tijuana because when people talk about Tijuana, they always say, "Oh, the dangers of the border town." It's a place where you can get away with anything you want. There's just a lot of like bad reputation that Tijuana carries, and I really want to like emphasize that it's a beautiful city with beautiful people who who are literally just giving you the shirts off their back so that you have something to wear because their infrastructure is not that solid either, and so for them to be able to help, to want to help, and obviously I'm oversimplifying it because I'm not as involved with the politics and the organizing that's taking place in Tijuana. But I will say that there is that support, you know, for the most part, and it's what's made the work a lot more easier for El Otro Lado and for the Transgender Law Center, because you've seen how like this system, this grassroots system of shelters and organizations have all come together and created this network to like support a pipeline that can advocate for migrants coming through, and migrants not just from Central America, but migrants coming from like Eastern Africa, migrants coming from Haiti, migrants coming from all walks of life, because that's what we see a lot of the time. You just, whenever I'm volunteering at El Otro Lado, you just never know what language interpretation we're gonna need. I believe one day we had like people that spoke like 8 different languages or something. And so that just tells you kind of like the diversity in migration there, that Tijuana really is a city of migrants.
Give us some idea of what your work there actually entails. I mean, are you helping people apply for asylum into the U.S., or are you also helping them mediate with any issues with the Mexican government? I mean, what is kind of your typical workload there?
So as a volunteer and as someone who's not a lawyer, I report to an attorney, and and we work together specifically on the Migrant Protection Protocol, for example, which basically means like MPP is what it stands for. And so someone who is MPP means that they are in Mexico, specifically, let's say Tijuana, for example, and they have their hearing with a judge, an immigration judge, in a couple of weeks. Instead of staying inside a facility or being released into the US, they place them in Mexico in the meantime. And so the work, that's actually really hard. It's a hard situation because for us as legal advocates, because when we're trying to file their I-589, their asylum application, we don't really know what kind of, like, the questions that they ask in that application are almost counterintuitive because they're not in the United States. And so we really have to follow the guidelines of the attorneys who are learning all of these new laws and policies as we speak. You know, every day it's something new. And so we're guided by these attorneys, como at El Otro Lado, or the Transgender Law Center, or sometimes Carecen, the Central American Resource Center has come in. And there's so many other orgs like Chirla as well. And I know that I'm missing definitely a few more, but these are some of the key players that I've collaborated with.
Let's talk about your time in Tijuana again this past summer, though. I mean, you were down there during COVID-19 and working with Transgender Law Center, and let's talk about what it's like to be LGBTQIA or an HIV/AIDS positive person, seeking asylum. Because I think even answering that, people will get a better understanding of just how, one, sometimes dangerous, and two, why it's a public health concern.
Most definitely. So it was really hard to be in Tijuana during a pandemic because, I mean, personally, also, like, everyone's sheltered in place. I was pretty much by myself there. I reported to an attorney, but it was all remote. And thankfully, like, I had already made a solid network there that I can like rent a room and stay with people that are doing work there with shelters, and have created programs like Food Not Bombs in Tijuana that supports community with food justice. And so even with that said, though, it was really hard to be there to witness like how this pandemic is affecting people in different countries, and specifically in countries where people are in transit. So you see how, like, I remember sometimes I would go to the shelters to give like a little talk, a Know Your Rights talk, and to be quite honest with you, the border is closed. No one can cross right now. So all we would tell people is like, you gotta wait it out, because I'm hoping for the best in November, hoping things can change. But as of right now, there's nothing that you can do in terms of like presenting yourself, entering with inspection or without inspection, and presenting yourself at the port of entry. And so that made it very difficult because that just means that people have to wait it out and be careful, right? Because this pandemic is insidious. Like this virus can just get you, and you have to be careful. And I want to say that Tijuana did practice safety protocols. Like they check your temperature when you enter a place. They made you step on a mat that's soaked with like disinfectant liquid of some sort, and they have you wear your mask at all times. Um, you have to like wash your hands. Like there's hand sanitizer there. So I think that people were trying their best, with the resources that are available to them. One thing that I didn't do though while I was there was to get tested for COVID, because I try to get tested regularly, especially since I'm going to school in person and I'm HIV positive. So I have a compromised immune system, and I want to make sure that I'm taking care of myself and that I get tested, So that's important to me. But it was hard for me to get tested while I was in Tijuana. There was a place that I was told that I could go to and get tested. I didn't really try, but at the same time, I was mostly like quarantined to myself, and I was working, and so I would sometimes go to the transgender law office. We have a little satellite office there. Or eventually I discovered this really cute cafe just down the street from where I was staying, and no one was there. So I would just stay there every day and just study from like morning to afternoon or to evening. So I tried my best to like stay, like have a physical distance and such. And so I didn't really try to get tested for COVID out there, just because I thought that if I just didn't know what to think, and I didn't want to like put myself maybe in a precarious situation or something.
We've brought up the topic of the detention camps, prisons, whatever we want to call them, where these migrants are being held in the U.S., or some of them are. And you mentioned, during a time of a pandemic, what do we know about the situation within them regarding COVID? Are they being tested? Do they have any protocols? Are they being, is there any protection that's being offered to these people
while they're detained? That's a really good question. So a lot of the people that we worked with were in the Otay Mesa Detention Center, which is like across the border from Tijuana in San Diego. And they would tell us a lot of stories that like they weren't getting like soap to wash their hands. They were being like crowded in a pod, like these, like each cell, I guess you could say, like 4 to a pod. They wouldn't believe you if you thought that you had COVID symptoms. You would really have to like advocate for yourself consistently and almost aggressively in order for them to even pay attention to you. And by they, I'm also talking about like nurses and doctors in those spaces. And so thankfully, like the 2 clients that I worked with who were HIV positive had a smoother transition out. But there were 2 clients that I also worked with who had COVID, and they were quarantined and sort of like put in the cells where everyone who had symptoms of COVID are placed. But again, not enough like health regulations to really make sure that they're safe, because essentially what you see here is what's happening in a lot of prisons as well. Like detention centers and prisons are owned by the same companies like Geo West, and they profit off people, and they don't care about people's health. And during this pandemic, to know that this is happening right now, and that over 200,000 people have died, it's really unfortunate to know that we have people incarcerated during a pandemic, and not only incarcerated, but violating their human rights, their personhood.
Let's talk about being LGBTQI and an asylum seeker, and talking about some of the specific experiences, or the intersectional experiences that we might not talk about, and we might not hear about, and how if we aren't supportive, or there are know organizations like the Transgender Law Center out there doing the work in supporting LGBTQI asylum seekers, that we're really failing, a number of folks who are put in dangerous situations at times. And I know you mentioned, a case that you were working on while you were down there in your article at thebody.com. So would love to hear you kind of summarize your thoughts about that specific case and how it highlights the issues that impacts our community.
Yeah, definitely. I guess I can also start with how a lot of the times when we're at the border, we are like helping attorneys translate, because a lot of the attorneys at the border don't speak Spanish, and I'm a Spanish native speaker, and so interpreting and what that looks like, in this work is really important, especially for folks who do justice language work. It's not easy, and it all depends on the situation. And so doing this type of triage work and working with attorneys and other advocates has been interesting, because for example, just to get some more perspective, a lot of the folks that were in some of these shelters or places that were sponsored by organizations, we would start preparing them for their credible fear interview. And this is all before COVID, right? This is like 2018, 2019. We were working with them on what to say when they had their interview with a Border Patrol agent, who basically will ask them, do you fear for your life? Why are they attacking you? Who is attacking you? What happened? Etc. Did you go to the police? These are all standard questions that they ask people during this like credible fear interview. And we sort of prepare them, not to say that they don't know what they're saying, because they really do. These are people that have experienced death, and many are advocates. Many are people that are organizers in places like Honduras, and this is not about giving a voice to the voiceless, because I don't want to follow that rhetoric that a lot of like people, both white and brown saviors have, because that's not what it is. These are people who have organized in their countries, and we're collaborating together. We are in a network together. And so this is all collaborative work. And so when we're working on how to like figure out these processes, these questions that they're being asked, a lot of the violence that you notice is really intense, and it's triggering, especially with the work that I did specifically with LGBT clients. As someone who's also identifies as queer and gender non-binary, like I felt like very like that vicarious trauma that you're translating and interpreting and reacting to in two different languages can be very intense, and some of the graphic situations that these clients have gone through, which I don't really want to repeat, but it's just very, very gruesome and violent. And you see how homophobic, transphobic slurs and the violence that happened while they were being thrown those slurs, you realize just how powerful those words can be, because you finally have a mental image of what they went through as people were spatting those homophobic and transphobic slurs at them. And it's so violent that it's ingrained in your head. So whenever you hear those words, you can't help but think about what was happening to them while they were shouting those words to them. And those are things that I wouldn't even want to repeat because it's that graphic. But yes, those are the things that sometimes you witness on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing. I think we've got a couple questions from the audience. Thank you for sending them in. So if you have some, continue to do so. We'll get them to Julie. John, would you like for me to ask? Oh, you're on mute.
Life in the time of Zoom. One of the questions is, what would be, say, the top 3 changes you would recommend to implement or change to improve the process? So to address these issues of specifically, public health concern of immigration. Do you have kind of some specific steps you'd like to see changed?
Oh yeah, we need to abolish ICE. We need to abolish this system. We need to free everyone that's incarcerated. Like, we need to start there before anything. That's where we got to start. We got to abolish ICE. And it's been done. We've seen a facility in Santa Ana in Southern California completely like be removed. Like we can do this. We can hold our city council members, we can hold our representatives accountable and have them, demand them to remove any tie, to remove themselves of any ties with Geo West and all of these other private companies, to remove ICE from their cities. We can do this. We can mobilize and make this happen. And so we need to start there. And that's even before we get to 2 and 3, steps 2 and 3. Like, we just need to start with abolishing ICE.
I guess to add to that, this is one of my questions. I mean, it's obvious whoever wins the election, it's not just one person that's going to make this all better. We start with abolishing ICE, but many people kind of need some framework, if you will. Lots of people will talk about, no, what we need is immigration, reform. But let's say we do start with abolishing, some of these departments. Now, what would be ideal if we were looking even start at step 2? If that makes sense.
That makes perfect sense. And I also just want to reiterate that ICE is a baby monster. This happened post 9/11. This is very recent. These systems, these hegemonic institutions are fairly new. And people think that, again, going back to this historic amnesia, that people just forget, they don't read, or they just forget the history of the violence in this country. They don't realize that these institutions are new, and we can completely eradicate them still, right now. It's not like we're gonna change the Constitution or nothing. We're trying to stop agencies that have been killing children and people. And we can do that. And we can learn from these mistakes. And not enough time has happened, so we can still correct those wrongs. Now, in my opinion, and this is just coming from someone who is not a lawyer, who's a law student, and has, I just want to reiterate that, has background in health as a writer, as a journalist, specifically on HIV, I would say that once we've completely eradicated ICE, and we're trying to bring people in for services, let's follow a case management system, let's bring children emergency Medi-Cal once they've transitioned from ORR into their families. But let's remove anything that's affiliated with incarceration, because this country loves to incarcerate people, and it's just part of their agenda. And we need to start with dismantling that and deconstructing our minds as to why we've normalized that for so long. So we definitely need to start there. A lot of what I see with defunding the police, abolitionist work, that is all tied to immigration. Just as we need to abolish ICE, we need to understand the problems with mass incarceration and how that's affected our country, how poverty comes into play, how the communities most affected by these systems are Black and brown people. And I just really would love for people to just educate themselves more on these issues, because I feel like I'm preaching to the choir. And it's funny because I used to be a Jehovah's Witness, and I feel like I would preach all the time when I was a little kid about the end of the world and Jehovah this and Jehovah that. And now I feel like I'm preaching, but in another way. And just like back then people weren't listening to me, I feel like people sometimes are not receptive to these conversations either. And so there's only so much that we can do until people hold themselves accountable to what they should start understanding.
There's some talk about whether or not we're in a kind of unique or a rare moment in history where people are willing to reckon with certain things that they, generally ignore. And this crazy year of 2020 has kind of played an important part in bringing certain issues, obviously racial justice, top of the line, but as well as public health, our incredible laziness as democratic citizens, small d. Talking about history, though, I kind of am a little bit worried, because it's the more you go back in American history, it's never been good for immigration. We all remember, we remember reading about, the Chinese Exclusion Act, all kinds of horrible things. The INS preceding ICE was not exactly, a model agency either. Are there other countries that we can look to that handle migration better and might serve as a model for us to maybe take certain ideas from and import them here to use as a new system? Do you know of any?
I wouldn't say I'm an expert on that kind of conversation yet. Eventually, I'm going to make my way into a graduate program, and that's going to be some of the research that I want to do after I finish this JD. But I mean, and this is also just something that I've also looked into as well. Like you check out like Canada's USCIS, right? Like their own interpretation of what our USCIS looks like, and you realize that it's so much more chill than us. Like we have no chill, and like they don't find you that much. Like just recently there was like a, a policy that thankfully a judge blocked, but Trump wanted children who had the juvenile visas and were then applying to LPR to pay a $1,500 fine for the application. $1,500. These are families that are poor. These are families that are struggling, especially during the pandemic. And most likely they did not get a stimulus package. And you want to go and charge them $1,500 on top of that? Like, what do you, it just doesn't make sense. It doesn't add up. And it's just a slap on the face at the end of the day. Like he might as well just spit at us, because that's basically what's going on right now. And you think about what other countries are doing, like just Canada, our neighbor, and you realize that they're actually getting a stimulus package. People are actually there's actually language that's cohesive, that people can understand and navigate as they're trying to apply for like a fiance visa, or I don't know what, you know what I mean? But like these are things that other countries are doing, and it works for them. And we're supposed to be the country that was built with immigrants, and we pride ourselves in that. And I personally think that France should just take that Statue of Liberty away, because that is all a show at this point. I don't think that Lady Liberty needs to be out here watching all the.
We have a question from an audience member, and this has to do with the new interim ICE director, Tony Pham, who actually is a Vietnamese refugee himself, and talks very openly about, coming to America after the fall of Saigon. And there's this, it creates such a complex situation, a lot of misunderstanding, and I think, division within immigration or immigrant groups. Who's the good immigrant, who's the bad immigrant? You come to this country so long as it's the legal pathway. There's the trip up there. What's the legal pathway? Because when you look back at the historic policies, I mean, if there is no policy or an open legal way for you to get here, then automatically you're looked as a criminal. Would love to hear your thoughts. The question is really what your thoughts are about Tony Pham being the interim ICE director here, and what is happening there. What are we supposed to gather from this kind of appointment?
I don't know enough about Tony right now to really make a comment about him. I will speak though on that narrative that like, oh, you need to just come here the right way, and all that misunderstanding. It's really what it is, that they're gaslighting us, basically. That's all it really is, when it comes down to it. And just to break it down to you, people who are currently in detention, who may not qualify for a bond, which means that they can be released if they pay like $1,200 going up, because it can increase for sure. If they entered at the port of entry and presented themselves and said, I fear for my life, they have a lesser chance of being released through a bond application than with someone who entered without inspection. And someone who enters without inspection basically means that they crossed the wall or did something, you know what I mean? Like there was a violation of some sort, and but they qualify for a bond to be released into the US. And this is all happening within a pandemic. And so when I was working with some of my clients, I was just thinking, this is so counterintuitive. Like, it doesn't make sense. It's a catch-22, and people are just being tricked. It's a trap. It's basically what it is. There's no clarification. There's so many myths that need to be debunked. There's so many people that are living in fear right now, especially during this pandemic. And it's almost like, do I want to take my chances? Do I want to enter without inspection and then figure out if I do qualify for a bond, or will I be locked up and detained and most likely contract COVID-19. So those are a lot of serious questions that people are asking themselves right now in Tijuana.
And we should point out for anyone who's been watching this and is wondering, you're wearing a mask because you are actually on campus there in New Orleans.
Yes,
in
I'm
one of the
on
school
campus right
buildings.
now at my law school, and so they have a very good protocol in terms of like wearing a mask if you're going to be on campus. The majority of my classes are on Zoom right now, so I like to call it Zoom School of Law, but it's basically like I get to be here in the library and study, and thankfully it's been pretty empty, and so it's just a matter of being safe and careful.
I just have a question, and this is really probably a very basic question that most people maybe already know. But so while people are waiting, say in Tijuana, I'm not pronouncing that correctly, Tijuana.
Mhm.
What do they do with their? Are their movements restricted? Are they able to find work? Or, or are they just sitting there every day trying to get through this process? What are their daily lives like?
It really just depends on the people. I'm not going to go into too much details about these things either, because these are facts that could also jeopardize people's applications. And so that's
Sure.
one thing that I always try to be mindful of as I'm writing articles or as I'm speaking with platforms about some of this stuff. Not that I want to be secretive or withhold information, but I just really want to be mindful of the fact that people's lives are at stake, and I don't want to run the risk of like jeopardizing anyone's chances of any form of status, And so it's just, and I want to say that also as a overall like message to people that want to volunteer, because I see a lot of white people that go to Tijuana and they want to volunteer and help, and that's amazing because you most likely have the time and the resources to do that, and I applaud you on that. But don't go around taking selfies with people. Don't go around being this white savior, this problematic white savior. And I say this to brown people too, because we do this just the same. We have to be mindful of what we're doing when we're out there, and whose privacy we need to protect, because these are people that are fighting for their case, literally fighting to advocate for themselves. And so just to be prudent.
As we wind down on time, a couple of questions that I have for you really centers around the election. Like I said before, whoever wins, we're going to have to work with that president and his administration in regards to immigration. At this point, there's a whole lot of work to be done. Do you have thoughts, or do you know of the advocates and activists who are working, out there in the fields, like the organizations that you had mentioned, if there is a plan, if President Trump wins or is reelected, and if there is a different plan if Joe Biden wins?
I can't really speak on that because I'm not in those organizations right now, like in the midst of it, like internally, and so I wouldn't know what their game plan is right now because every organization strategies differ.
Yeah, I would imagine. I think you're right. And going back to, if the priority, I think for many advocates, especially those who want to see ICE abolished, that would continue. Because the second half of that question is, you had mentioned defund the police, and the movement is picking up. And you're starting to see cities really think about, reallocating resources, and not necessarily all to law enforcement. Do you think that the same can be said for the movement to abolish ICE?
Yes, definitely. And I gave an example about the facility in Santa Ana, which is like in Orange County. That happened, and that all happened through community organizing with organizations like Familia and Trans Latina Coalition. So I definitely want people who are watching this to make donations to those organizations. Trans Latina Coalition is a great organization. They are led by trans women and trans Latina migrants, and they're at the forefront in policy work on the local level. And so I encourage you to do some research to fund these organizations that are doing the work, that are doing the groundwork, Familia is another organization. Who else am I thinking of? Casa Ruby. Actually, the organization called Casa Ruby that's based out in DC. We just interviewed her with The Body a few weeks ago. Ruby Corrado, who's the executive director. She's Salvadoran. She's a migrant. She's trans, and she came to DC about 20 years ago, and now has a nonprofit that works with LGBT homeless youth in the DC area. And she just recently created a house for LGBT migrants who are coming out of detention, so that we have this solid pipeline to assist them and better advocate for them as they transition into the United States. And so I imagine that organization is going to need a lot of support. So if you can make a donation to Casa Ruby in the DC area, that would be amazing. And that's one way that people can advocate, because many times people are like, what can I do? I want to be out there, and I just, for X, Y, and Z reasons, you may not be able to, and that's fine. Funding is really, really important. And if you are someone that can donate your time, if you're an attorney, if you are a nurse, if you are a dentist, then donate your time pro bono to organizations that are doing this work at the border.
Kind of along that last point, and harking back to, with recognition of you not wanting to give away any confidences or put anyone in danger, could you talk about some of the special health concerns regarding LGBTQ migrants and some of the challenges they face, whether it's, in the journey to the border or getting across the border? What is special about their situation that people should know about?
I guess one thing that I do want to emphasize is that trans women are many times harassed. Unfortunately, this does happen both in detention centers when they're in the hands of U.S. custody. Like, the United States does not have a protocol on how to be humans and treat people with respect. I would also say that the police in Tijuana tend to harass some of these trans women. They entrap them, they lie and say, oh, I'm arresting you because you had drugs on you. Or you're doing sex work. They gaslight them a lot. So and many times they also get sexually assaulted by these people. So that's just kind of one perspective on what goes on sometimes. Now, I don't want to say that's always all the time, but if I were to ask someone who's trans and migrant about her interaction with the police in Tijuana and ICE and Border Patrol, she probably wouldn't say it was very good.
And what about, say, they're successful, they're if they get documented entry or whatever, do they have enough of these organizations, such as the one in DC you mentioned, where they can make connections and build kind of a base of community? Or are, you're talking about kind of this wonderful connections and networks of your family and their friends and neighbors. Yeah. Is it a bigger challenge for some of the LGBTQ folks?
It is, and that's why I think we got to support our local LGBT orgs that are doing this work. Andrea Lint in Florida does really great work. Her organization is Adriana's Place. Ana Andrea in Texas has her own house, just like Casa Ruby. Ruby is actually her mentor. So Ana Andrea in Texas, if you Google Ana Andrea, Casa de Ana Andrea in Texas, you'll find resources there. In San Francisco, ELA, which I imagine you all know that organization as well, right? Being in San Francisco, they do great work as well with trans migrants. And I work, and I know all of the people in these organizations. They're all my friends, and they're all incredible people that I'm very blessed to know. And so all it takes is research. People need to dig up, what organizations are helping, and grassroots led, organizations led by trans people, because many times these LGBT organizations don't want to give them jobs, don't want to promote them and make them leaders. They believe in charity work rather than advocacy, like the Los Angeles LGBT Center, where I work. So I can at least throw shade at them and be like, no, they're not really advocating sometimes. I will say though that there is the Trans Wellness Center in Los Angeles that Mariana is incredible, and she is holding down the fort. So no, I don't want to throw so much shade out at the Los Angeles LGBT Center. They are getting better. They recently changed their name to LGBT Los Angeles LGBT Center. It used to just be the Gay and Lesbian Center. So like it's baby steps, right? People have their blind spots and we are working towards that. But the Trans Wellness Center in Los Angeles is another great organization. Y Mariana es una dulzura. I love her very much. I've had the privilege to know a lot of these organizers over the last few years as I was growing myself. And so, yeah, those are organizations kind of like around the country that people can start supporting and donating to.
Julie, I want to thank you so much for joining us here on the program and for sharing your article that was written at thebody.com. I enjoy your articles very much. So if you joined us today, like the work that you've heard that Julie is involved in, you can go to thebody.com. The article that we talked about today is it's the title of the program, Immigration as a Public Concern. And so I think, yes, although it wasn't brought up, as John had mentioned in the vice presidential debate last night, it is a topic that will come up again that we need to be mindful of. And there's a whole lot of work. I'm going to leave it to John for the last words.
Well, thank you. Thank you for joining us today, Julia, and we've enjoyed this. If there's one place you'd like to send someone to, can you share a URL or something where people can get more information about immigrants? You've mentioned a number of different organizations. Is there a great news source? Is there a great, clearinghouse sort of place that you'd like to give people, a top?
Like a shout out to an organization, you mean?
Sure.
Yeah, well, I guess I would say the ones that I just mentioned before.
Okay.
Casa Ruby would be one of them for sure. Casa Ruby has a transmigrant house named Bella Evangelista, and that house is named after a Guatemalan transmigrant who died in DC in the early 2000s because she didn't have support for housing. And so if I were to ask people to make a donation, I would definitely encourage them to go to Casa Ruby.
Very good. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, my co-host, Michelle Meow, here on the Michelle Meow Show. You can find out more programs we have coming up at commonwealthclub.org/MMS. Thank you, everyone. Stay safe and healthy. We'll see you again.